Good afternoon. My name is Carol Higham, and I'll be moderating this discussion between our distinguished guests who will be discussing historical precedents that set up the various fields of resource management, immigration, and trade. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then they will each take a few minutes and give some background in response to some questions I sent them a few weeks ago. And then I will lead them through their paces, like in graduate school, with some questions that they have not seen. And then we'll open it up to the audience, and I hope that you will all participate, because if not, I have questions for you all. So we'll make sure this is a good interactive. You won't fall asleep after the pasta at lunch. This will be lively.
There's no grade at the end, though. Is there?
Right, yeah, there's no grade. That's what you think.
Great.
So on my left, I'd like to introduce Dr. Irene Bloemraad, who is at UC Berkeley. She is the Thomas G. Barnes Chair of Canadian Studies, and her specialty is immigration. To her left is Tamara Woroby, Dr. Tamara Woroby. She is at Towson State and SAIS at Johns Hopkins, and her specialty is trade. And on the end is Dr. David Massell, who is at the University of Vermont, and his specialty is resource development. So Irene, if you would start us off with your
5 minutes.
Yes, your 5 minutes.
You know, I really do feel like this is QEs and I'm back in grad school. This is really quite intimidating. Really intimidating. All right, so the charge that we were given was very minor. It does feel like grad school and qualifying exams, because in qualifying exams you have to know everything about your particular field. And the charge of this panel was, we're going to discuss your topic, immigration, from 1867 to the present, US-Canada relations in 5 minutes. That was it. So I have 2 points around US-Canada relations and immigration as sort of broad, synthesizing themes, and then some implications for politics and policy. So the first claim is that as much as everyone here in the room loves Canada, most international migrants really want to go to the United States. And what this means is that the ability of Canada to attract migrants or get migrants is a function of policies in the United States and has to be much more active than what the US does. So the US really didn't have to do, and still doesn't have to do much, in order to attract migration. And because of this, I would say it has adopted a rather laissez-faire system of immigration control or immigration policy. And to the extent that there is a policy, especially after the borders were closed in the 1920s to a large extent, it has been a policy of control. So keeping people out and then maybe edging the door open to certain types of people at certain moments. But it was really, the policy is control, and that's the extent of it. In the Canadian case, because most immigrants want to go in general to the United States, there has been much more active politics of attraction. So if you go back to your history books, Clifford Sifton, who was Minister of Immigration back in the very late 19th century, early 20th century, had all kinds of different schemes to try to get Europeans to set their sights north of the border and go to Canada, rather than the attraction, for example, of free land in the United States. So once the frontier in the United States ended, Homestead Act, and people had parceled out that land, then suddenly there was more interest in migration to Western Canada. The other thing that has happened is that because of the attraction of the United States, Canada's also had to work harder to keep its immigrants and, frankly, to keep its own Canadian-born residents. And so this has meant that Canada has developed more of an integration program than the United States. And so we can think historically about the massive movement of French Canadians across the border from Quebec into New England. And actually, as the US was closing the door to immigrants, after the 1920s, the only group of migrants who were allowed sort of unfettered access to the United States were people within the Western Hemisphere, which largely meant Mexico and Canada. And so Canada actually, Canadian would-be migrants from Canada to the United States benefited. But what that meant was that people would sometimes use Canada as an entrepot, sort of midway step in a journey. So they would come from Europe, and they would, or from Asia, in the case of Chinese migrants, go to Canada, and then go across the border. And in fact, going back to this theme of border control, the US border control, its initial concerns were not with Mexican migrants coming across the southern border, but Chinese migrants coming across the northern border. So a lot of American early border control policy was because of the permeability on the border. A second sort of a theme, I would say, in US-Canada policy is that both, today they are seen as somewhat different, that the US really focuses on family reunification. Two-thirds to three-quarters of migrants who come into the United States come in because someone in the country sponsored their permanent residency. In the Canadian case, it's an economic point system. Increasingly over the last 20 and 30 years, there's been a lot of focus on selecting migrants, and people often highlight that as a big difference between Canada and US policy. But when you look at the origins of those policies and what preceded them, you see that a similarity between the two countries was a focus on ethno-racial constructions of the nation. And so looking at the policies of Canada and the United States from the 19th century up to mid-century, you see absolute parallel lockstep processes of excluding different groups. First excluding the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1880 in the United States, the Chinese head tax in 1882 in Canada. You have the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan that shuts out migration to Japan in the first decade of the 20th century, both in the US and in Canada. And then you get extensions to all other migrants from Asia. And then more in the US case than in the Canadian case. You get extensions, or you get exclusions of Italians, Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and then in World War II, basically equal policies of excluding Jewish refugees fleeing the impending Holocaust in Europe. And so that's actually a parallel story where we might want to think about how notions and diffusions of racial supremacy, notions of who is deserving, religious notions of the nation actually impact both the US and Canada equally, and whether there's policy exchange or ideational exchange, including in universities, as eugenics is at least has purchase in particular places. Now, arguably, the fact that the US goes to a family-based system and Canada goes to an economic-based system is similarly influenced by this ethno-racial sense of nationhood in the 50s and early 60s. In the United States, Southern Democrats and various other members of Congress did not want to open the doors to non-white migration. They felt that if they did family reunification, they were going to get Italians. They were going to get the Europeans who had come in the 1920s, and then this would keep the white racial nature of the United States. In the Canadian case, family reunification would also have meant family reunification of Italians, but in the Canadian case, they really didn't want chain migration of Italians. They didn't really want non-European migration either, and so they figured if they did a merit-based system, this would shut out people from countries where there was a limited access to college or higher education. So in a way, a similar logic led to somewhat different systems. And so in terms of thinking of 150 years of immigration policy, we have the fact that Canada is much more influenced by US policy than the United States is influenced by Canadian policy. That's not a big surprise. That's probably the story on a lot of different policy fields. And we see that most recently with Haitians and others who are fleeing the US to come to Canada making asylum claims as they face the ending of temporary protected status or deferred action of childhood arrival status. And then the second is a shared history of opening and closing the door, not just for economic reasons, but also as projects of ethno-racial nation building. And potentially, again, there's some shared notions about this in current debates around whether and to what extent both countries should let in Muslim migrants from the Middle East and other places. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was an excellent beginning. Tamara.
I'm going to speak on the economic aspects of the Canada-US relations, and of course, the primary one is the trade one. And the first thing I'd like to say in terms of a theme is that although the rhetoric is different right now, I think it's always been America first. And if you go back in time, we're starting with 1867, but in order to understand 1867, you have to understand the Reciprocity Treaty in 1854, and even before that, why the Reciprocity Treaty came about. which was a free trade agreement mostly on raw materials, but that's mostly what was being produced in those days. And Canada initiated that, and that's a theme that goes through. Canada initiated the Canada-US Free Trade Accord. Canada asked to be part of NAFTA. And if you go back in time, nothing's really changed. So when the Reciprocity Treaty was signed, and it was supposed to be in effect for 12 years, and 1866 came up, Canada was perfectly happy to continue it. But it's the US that decided in its interest that it wasn't going to continue. The US had a very strong protectionist element that happened to be strengthened by the fact that it was joined by anti-British forces following the end of the Civil War and the belief that Britain had gotten involved too much in American relations. And so we get to 1866 where Canada wants to have the reciprocity agreement and wants to be able to have the market of the US and isn't able to. And as the economic logic goes, then Canada goes, well, then who are we going to sell to? Because 20 years later, before that, Britain had cut off Canada with Corn Law repeals and Navigation Acts, etc. And it's only then that they look at each other. And so we say, you know, that Canada forms first the economic union, that becomes the political union that is our starting point for our discussion. So this, you might not be aware, but after 1867, for about another 12 or 15 years, even though it was formed as a country, Canada continued to, there were several attempts to try to get more free trade agreements with the United States, and in each case, the US was the one that said no. In the 1930s, you have the whole world putting up tariffs, and the Smoot-Hawley and countries that were more open were very aware that that wasn't the way to go. By 1937, Canada is again asking for tariff reduction, and there is a bilateral agreement signed. The US, because it's good for the US, realizes that after 10 years of closing up to trade, Roosevelt and others are realizing you got to open to trade to grow an economy, is happy to go into that agreement, but only because it's good for America. In 1948, the world sort of changes. Irene talks about mid-century for immigration, mid-century for world trading arena changes to a much more liberal, progressive approach. So you have a reduction of tariffs everywhere. And by the time 1989 comes around and Canada's going into a US free trade accord, although a lot of people in Canada were against it, thinking it would hurt, people like Dick Lipsey and others who've looked at tariffs from 1948 realize that what Canada did is just let its tariffs come down gradually and very nicely from 1948 till late 1980s. So by the time NAFTA came around, which was, or first Canada-US free trade, it was just a bit more of a drop. So it was never as dramatic as everybody had thought. But why did the Canada-US free trade agreement come around? Because again, the US was thinking about itself and what was good for itself, which was America first. In the 1980s, the US ran huge fiscal deficits. And when you run fiscal deficits, somebody's got to finance it. And if you decide to finance it from abroad, you bring in capital, and you got to raise interest rates, and that raises the value of your currency. And that usually takes about an hour in an economics class to explain. So an easier way to explain a rising dollar that's making exports fall is to go, it's somebody else's fault. It's some other country that's flooding our markets. And we've been hearing a lot about that in terms of China. If you go back and read the history or pick up the New York Times of 1981, 82, it's the same thing, just put Japan in place of China, and it's the same story. So what was good for America in the 1980s, making America great again, was to bring in voluntary export restraints in cars and protect the American industry and forget about the fact, or not really think about the fact of what that was doing to Canada. And the Canadians then had to be the ones who, once again, had to deal with this. So if things sound different today, it's a good thing to get our historical perspective and go, it's not really that different. The rhetoric's just a little more plain and not as diplomatic, but that would be one of my themes. I'm going to just say two other things that I just want to throw out that have trade implications, and then we can maybe discuss it more. And the first one is the idea that all along Canadians have been much more comfortable with thinking about the collective, the whole, as opposed to the individual. And economically, the way that has shown up is the role of government has been much more accepted, whether it's that the government bails you out, the government guides you, but also that the government subsidizes you. And the whole idea of subsidies is also a historical thing economically, to grow the economy by having the government be more proactive. That, of course, leads to various trade issues when another country just decides that their exports are being hurt. What they can do is look at the things they're importing from you. So whether it's the softwood industry, whether it's Bombardier today, it's really comes down to the implications of one group of people, a society, looking at the fact that it's okay to have government in your life, and another one being very strongly saying no, and that means subsidies shouldn't be around either. And then the last thing that I'd like to say that has economic implications is maybe it comes from having more of a collective spirit in Canada, is that inequality, personal inequality, in the United States and Canada was about the same all the way through till about 1980. And those of you know Gini measures. In Canada in 1980, the Gini was 32, and in the United States it was 33. Today in Canada it's 33, and the US is 46. So those of us who follow inequality have been seeing this has been a steady thing since the 1980s. But most people, again, don't follow inequality trends until they get to a point where suddenly they're aware of them. And I think that what the US is experiencing today is a reaction on the part of the people who aren't the critical thinkers and the intellectuals, suddenly turning around with great anger and lashing out at political forces that, because they don't know where to put the blame. And that has implications also, because then it's easy to be anti-trade too, when it's really anti-technology, anti-machines that you should be.
Excellent. We're going to have so much to talk about here. David.
Thank you. So listening and considering my role as the historian on this panel, I'm reminded of the old Sufi parable of the blind men encountering an elephant for the first time, where the fellow who has his hand on the side of the elephant says, "Oh, the elephant, it's a wall." One with the trunk says it's a rope. The one touching the tusk says it's a spear, and so forth. And which blind man am I? I guess I'm reminded that while I have to teach the entire Canadian-American relationship, I do it every year or two across the 20 years that I've taught by referring to the works of scholarship in 100 different micro fields of this incredibly complicated interaction. But the one that I have touched and the one that I know has to do, I suppose, with resource development. And it's not so much a history of Canadians and Americans or one society and another. It really is a story of individual, when you get into the weeds, it's a story. I've written a couple of books on hydroelectricity in northern Quebec, working on a third, and it's about individual entrepreneurs, businessmen who happen to be Americans because they have the deepest pocket and they have the corporate networks to feed the products that may result, going after massive energy resources, which happen to be in northern Canada because the Canadian Shield is there and Canada happens to have constitutional jurisdiction over that territory. And then having to deal with policies, usually favorable and inviting ones at the provincial or federal level, making significant changes to riverine environments through the course of building dams with accompanying consequences for Native peoples who happen to be citizens of Canada as well. And what, I guess, the two things that I have learned from, to sugar it way down, I'm a Vermonter now, I can use that metaphor. 90% of the syrup really comes from Quebec, I know that. I've learned two things, and one is that, as Irene stated, for immigration in the United States, because of its deep pockets of capital, because of its corporate connections, not because they were Americans per se, tended to occupy the driver's seat where large-scale resource development, certainly across the Canadian and Quebec North, was concerned. So there was an America First element going on because the largest businessmen with the best connections happened to be in the States, though that wasn't exclusively the case. And that unlike the relationship between national states or societies, the relationship that I see is really about individuals, whether they be migrants in Mark Richards' research or in yours, Irene, looking for land or work or citizenship, or entrepreneurs looking to profit a set of shareholders, or members of the bureaucrats of a provincial government looking to somehow fill the coffers of a relatively impoverished Quebec in the in early 20th century. You have individuals acting within the constraints, the parameters formed by geography, formed by the relatively peaceful relationships since the 1870s or so between Canada and the United States and the imposition of the national policy in 1879. A shared political culture, right? Shared language, and as we know, Quebecers will speak English if you do business with them. Right. So there's no language. There's no language problem for Americans. A shared sense of contract law, and ultimately seizing opportunities as they come up. So that'll do it for 5 minutes.
Okay. Excellent. So a couple of themes that I've pulled out of the three of you was that in all areas there's a permeability over the border. There's a push and pull between the two countries. There's tensions between the individual and the state, between what individuals want and can do and what the state want and can do. So what I'd like to do in the lightning round is ask two of you, depending on the topic, to further explain issues that came up in other people's comments. So for the first one, I'd like Irene and David to think about the difference between the concept that Canada is a collaborative society, which was brought up by Tamara, versus the idea that the U.S. is an individual society, and whether that has historically affected policies, ideas, and incidents within your fields. This really is like graduate school.
It is like graduate school.
I bet you think faster than I do, Irene.
Thanks for the...
That's my way of saying it's going to take me a while to figure out.
that. So collaborative versus individualistic. Mm-hmm. Immigration, collaborative versus individual. I don't know, does that actually... That's not how so be it as it may, I do not think that that would be the way I would think through similarities or differences in US and Canada's immigration policy or the relative influence of one versus the other. Mm-hmm. And the reason I would say that is I would think more about the relationship between government, civil society, and market forces, businesses, for example, mm-hmm. and the relative weight or authority in the immigration field across the border. So what I mean by that is in the Canadian context, the federal government and at different times and different moments of time, and especially the current moment, provinces, have really been trying to be in the driver's seat for immigration. Now, does that mean that it's collectivist? I don't think so. I think it's just that they see that people who are in power or the bureaucrats who are running the government see immigration as part and parcel of nation building, and so they see this as a way to increase the labor market, to populate empty lands, ignoring, of course, the indigenous populations that are there. And so it's more that there's much more state intervention. And I would say this because if you look especially historically, thinking about the racial exclusion elements of Canadian history, when there were collectivist moments, it definitely was more to keep immigrants out, while the federal government wanted to bring immigrants in. Now, they could meet each other in terms of keeping them out. So I'm thinking here of British Columbia, and unions in British Columbia are people worried about keeping British Columbia very white, very similar to what was going on in California. And a lot of the activity there was to keep immigrants out. The Canadian government wanted immigrants in to populate Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba. And so where they met was, okay, we'll let immigrants in, but only certain types of immigrants. And so I don't know if that's collectivist or not, but I would actually say there was tension there. In the US case, you know, up until 1906, the US government didn't even administer immigration, really. So for the first 100 and some years of the United States' existence, it was an empty federal government. You know, some have said it was mostly just a government of post offices and political parties. And there was no border control. Border control doesn't start until the 1920s. Federal oversight of citizenship processing and naturalization only starts in 1906. So much of the 19th century is just the complete absence of any kind of federal action in the United States. And Congress starts getting involved in 1880, or in the 1880s, and then increasingly so, but it's an absent state. And so is it more individualist? I'm not sure, but because it's an absent state, what you have is you have more individual decision making, and then you have market forces because passenger ships are bringing in people into New York. And so you do have the New York state government trying to regulate passenger ships coming in and bringing Europeans. But I would think of it, I think not collectivist individual, I would think more of state action or federal state action versus federal state inaction or just non-existence in immigration.
Okay, excellent. David?
Yes. Tough question. So I think in general I would just reject that US / sort of US-Canadian contrast, stereotypical contrast entirely, where the world of resource development and business and market force is concerned. What I've seen, the piece of the elephant that I've touched, rather, suggests that Canada and the United States have much more in common than different in that regard in terms of an intimate relationship between government and business. And in both states, from the get-go, government saw its essential responsibility as greasing the wheels of business, as producing jobs through business, which in a democratic process will yield ultimately votes, and around the cycle goes for the maintenance of power in a democracy. So I see that as a similarity, not as a difference. And I see Canadian businessmen, while operating at a somewhat smaller scale than Americans, certainly in the classic era of American corporate capitalism at the turn of the last century, just as ferociously hard-headed and individualistic, the Herbert Holtz, the William Prices, as any Andrew Mellon or Arthur Vining Davis or J.B. Duke and what have you. If there's a difference at all, in my research, it's that under the British North America Act of 1867, the provinces have constitutional control of the resources within their domains and the ability to accrue revenue from those resources. And so provinces and provincial governments become the crucial places to get your concession, your resource concession, to turn the key to open the door to get in and make a profitable business of it.
Good. Go ahead. Yeah, please do.
I would argue from an economic point of view, though, that the distinction and the differences do have different consequences.
Are we allowed to disagree with one another?
Are we?
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Discuss.
Yes.
And I think the whole role of Crown corporations as a growth vehicle is a big distinction in terms of the two countries. The tolerance for tax rates, the tax burden in Canada is greater because I think Canadians nevertheless see they're getting more for their taxes. The pride of having a universal health care system. And I think historically there has been, I don't know if it's a especially American thing, but as someone who looks at American society, I'm often, you know, just floored by how don't let government in your life even the least little bit, because then it'll open the door. And, you know, after the shooting here in Vegas, the Australian Prime Minister who brought in strong gun controls was so scathing about American society and basically saying, you know, you guys just don't get it. And an American analyst turned around and said, no, you don't get us. Because gun control, or the desire not to have gun control, is a proxy for don't let government in your life. And I think that's a very profound kind of comment to make, that, you know, if you let them take even one big machine gun from me, that means that they'll be in my life in all kinds of ways, and you just can't open that door. And when you understand American public's desire to keep government, this really strong desire to keep government out of your life, you kind of get a little bit more sense that maybe the society is not that irrational about rejecting gun control laws if you start understanding the pressure points of the society.
And that tension about whether government's good or bad, whether government should be in, and that, what you all just brought up, raises some questions about regionality, because different parts of the US and Canada have different relationships with their governments, with the outside governments. So I'm going to let this be a free-for-all, since you all are discussing amongst yourselves. When do you see regionality historically playing a role within your field, where the region shapes responses more than the nation does? So for instance, well, to give you a minute to think, for instance, the Great Plains, thinking about themselves as a wheat area, various movements at different points to erase the border and come together as an area that works through that. The Northwest Coast thinking of themselves more as a region and working out or discussing whether they can come up with ways that works out different ways of dealing with migrants, native populations that cross the borders back and forth in the regional concept without seeing the national border. So where are there places where regionality plays more of a role than the nationality?
Well, I've mentioned the role of the provinces in my own field. I think that's probably a foundational fact to keep in mind. And for Quebec, which is the province I know best, it's not regionality, it's provinciality, it's nationality, nation. That's as old as French Canada, and it's ever present. And even if foreigners are doing the developing, then French Canadians are griping about it, understandably. So certainly in Quebec, regionality or provinciality is a factor from the get-go, though Quebec can't really do anything about it until the so-called Quiet Revolution of the 1960s. Yeah.
Excellent.
From the economic side, one of the sort of top three ways in which the Canadian economy stands out is there's regional income inequality that just persists. Every country has inequality across regions, but over time they sort of come together. In the case of Canada, it's east-west, and whether it's national policy and artificial reasons for that, whether it's resource prices and manufacturing prices going in different ways, whether it's not allowing for pipelines to be built that then chokes up your product. And the fact is that if you look in the case of Canada anyway, Ontario has been the have, and the West has been the hinterland, the exploited. And then the last 15 years have been just this aberration historically, where suddenly the have provinces were in the West, and that's just turning back to where it's going to be. But the national energy policy still keeps scars for people in the West. So I think the implications are that part of that ugly East-West divide is coming forward again with the cancellation of the pipelines, and it's kind of like a new national energy policy and another Trudeau, and that will eventually hurt Trudeau in any kind of negotiations that he's going to have to be undertaking, because he may be very attractive and have the wonderful progressive liberal values, but if he's got a divided country, it's going to be harder for him.
Needs to look south to see how that's going.
Regionalism. So if we think of regionalism as like north-south, and that New England or the northeast coast might be an economic zone, or the west might be an economic zone, or the plains might have similar interests, I don't think you have much of that in terms of immigration. At certain moments of history, as I already mentioned, California and British Columbia, Washington State, clearly the anti-Asian sentiments from the late 19th century through to the early 20th were being driven entirely from the West Coast and really influencing Washington, D.C. and Ottawa. So that would be a regional story, I think. Other than that, I'm not sure that there's a regional story that crosses the border except for migration. So obviously French Canadian and Atlantic Canadian migration into the New England area, people from Nova Scotia going down to Massachusetts, French Canadians going down. And then in the plains, people moving back and forth. So one sort of fun fact is that various US states back historically in the late 19th and early 20th century had laws on their books that certain professions or property ownership and other things were denied to people who weren't citizens. And so you had these exclusions. And then in some court cases that I've looked at, they would say, well, yes, that's true. If you're an alien, you're not allowed to do this. But Canadians are the exception. We're just going to let them do this. Because Canadians weren't really foreigners in some cases, in some places. And it probably meant because this person was of British background or something, or German background, and they were in Michigan and they weren't that far from the border and such. So you have sort of borderlands moments, I think, in history. But in terms of otherwise, I think then it becomes a much more standard story about US politics has been influenced in various ways by the US South and the history of slavery and the implications of dealing with slavery and the legacies of slavery. And so that clearly plays out in US immigration. There's nothing really parallel in the Canadian context. And in the Canadian context, we have French-Canadian nationalism, we have independence, and that clearly plays out on things around multiculturalism, integration, immigration, and there's not really a great parallel in the US. So there's regionalism, but they're country-specific. Yeah. And then the last thing that might be interesting in terms of regionalism and sort of sub-state or like intergovernmental relations is that in the current moment, every single Canadian province has some kind of provincial nominee program to bring in immigrants directly into the province, and all provinces are basically on board that they want to do this, and all provinces have integration policies to do something to help the immigrants get settled. And if you look down in the United States, it's just all over the map. And so clearly there's been many states in the US who want to do everything possible to exclude immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, are doing all kinds of local and state policies to scare immigrants away and have them self-deport. But at the same time, especially since Trump was elected, but even before that, there are other states and localities that are doing sanctuary city initiatives, or in California now, very much pro-undocumented immigrants. And this is setting up all kinds of federalist challenges, constitutionality challenges between the states and the federal government. And so there's much more contestation in the United States in the current moment than in the Canadian moment, where everyone sort of seems on the program of Canada welcomes immigrants, we have a multicultural society, we want them to become citizens, we like refugees, not too many, only when we say so, but otherwise things are going good. I think that would be it.
Excellent.
May I? Your comment about regions crossing borders is excellent, and I'm reminded, well, first of something that I've learned from Mark's work, that it was cheaper for a French Canadian to buy a railroad ticket, say, to the Maine coast, than it was to go out to the west, where there might have been a French Canadian community in the vicinity of Winnipeg. Thus, geographic proximity helps in the case of migration, right? And in my own field, energy, so Massachusetts has just in the last year issued a call for 1,200 megawatts of so-called clean power, and now hydro, large-scale hydro, is being considered clean power. And who's bidding? Well, Hydro-Quebec and Emera out of Nova Scotia and Nalcor out of Newfoundland Labrador. and Gaz Metro out of Quebec, which is now owning most of the power corporations within Vermont, which are subsidiaries. So geographic proximity is absolutely crucial where a commercial enterprise is concerned. Transmission of power is dictated by how close you are, and therefore how efficient you can transmit that power over distance. So cross-border regions, good point, yeah.
Well, and the reverse of that is when, historically within your field, has the border been invoked and used as a barrier between the two countries? I mean, a lot of what you all talked about was either lockstep or flow, but when has the border been invoked strongly? And not all three have to answer, but there are points where the northern and the southern borders in U.S. history are treated very differently.
Right.
But the Canadian-U.S. border has been invoked at various points. So within your parts of the elephant, I really like that, when has the border been invoked?
Chuck wants to answer.
Yes.
Can we get a chance to?
Yes. One more round, and then we'll come to you.
So, may I
Yeah,
ask a
yeah.
question?
Let's have one more round, and then I'll come out to the
It
audience.
won't be any more rounds because it's almost over.
I thought it went to 2:45, 2:30. I'll then go ahead and jump in. We're using House of Commons rules.
Whatever.
Goes to 2:45, Carol.
Question, especially for this panel. To what extent does trade policy affect immigration policy? What effect does immigration policy affect trade policy? Which is where as the social scientists say, where is this an endogeneity problem, or is it clear that causation is going in one direction or another?
Whose question are we answering?
Go ahead and answer his.
All right.
Yeah, so your question is, when do they influence each other? When does trade influence immigration?
You've got 150 years to look at here, so it should be a very simple.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're less. I think they're less co-influencing than you might think. Like if you think of a border and you think of flows of ideas, people, goods, services across that border as sort of the free trade kind of notion, they're less tied to each other to the extent that the two countries have been more open to the free trade of things than of people. And it's on both sides to the extent that Canada really doesn't want to lose Canadians or immigrants to the United States. Right. So it wants to facilitate movement, but at the same time, when the best and the brightest are all going to Silicon Valley to make a fortune, Canada's not too excited about that. And I still remember one of my favorite billboards of all time. This was during the Harper government. There was this huge billboard on the 101 when you're driving from San Francisco down to the airport, and it says, "Do you have H-1B visa problems?" This is the high-tech skilled temporary visa in the US. "Pivot to Canada." And then it had a URL where you could go and figure out something about the smart visa. And so they don't really, I mean, sure, they want to flow northward, but they want the people then to stop when they're in the north. And you know, French-Canadian priests were not too excited about their flock going down into New England. So that, and then I would point also to the safe third party agreement, which is, if we're thinking about current political issues, going to be a huge issue for the Canadian government right now, because at the demand of Canada, the two countries set up a policy that if you're an asylum seeker and you come to one of the two, you must make an asylum claim in the country you arrive in, because both countries are seen as safe, and so under the UN Convention, you should be making that asylum claim there. And it was all about Canada trying to protect itself from people coming from the United States. So the idea was that there'd be asylum shopping, that Central Americans or Mexicans would first go to the United States, try an asylum claim, be denied, and then move northward again to try again. And the Canadian government didn't want that, so they said, no, if you're in a safe third country, otherwise known as the United States, you must do your asylum claim there, because there's no other country really that you can like be, maybe Miquelon, I don't know, you're in Miquelon and then you can't go, I don't know. But like there's no other country than the United States, and if you get denied, too bad, you're denied and you cannot go into Canada. And that is being challenged right now because all of the people who are crossing into Canada in Manitoba and Ontario and Quebec, they're trying to circumvent that system. And so the Canadian government's going to have to make a decision about whether they suspend, end the safe third party agreement, but they really don't want to do that because then there's going to be a huge flow of people from the US northward. So I would say that they're somewhat separate because the people they want to control much more than the goods.
And congratulations, you also added in when the border gets invoked.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, it's very
I
nicely
meant to
done.
do that. There we go.
Yeah,
Yes.
A+.
All right.
Tamara and David, do you want to respond to this
I
one?
would agree. I would agree. I mean, we think of flow of goods and services, flow of labor, and every time we go into some kind of free trade agreement, people think flow of labor comes naturally after that, but that isn't necessarily true. And even if you think through the whole 60s and 70s, sort of what laid one of the groundworks for going into the free trade agreement was the Auto Pact. But the Auto Pact was a free trade agreement for producers. It was really growing scale, and you saw all these goods, so that the number one good that the U.S. sells to Canada today is auto parts, and the number one thing that Canada sells to the U.S. is auto parts, and they kind of really dwarf all the other things that we're selling to each other. Nothing about people moving. Didn't see a lot bigger increase in movement during that time period, even though the trade mushroomed.
Excellent.
Just to polish off the border invoking, which is growing out of this conversation, I think the classic moments in Canadian-American history are one in the 1870s with the national policy, which is an attempt to put significant tariffs on U.S. imports to nourish a newborn Canadian industry. But as Michael Bliss and others have pointed out, it backfired, and that was really the beginning of the branch plant economy. You just jump over the wall and put your factory on the other side and sell your goods directly to the Canadians. And then the other obvious sort of protectionist fit was in the 1960s under Elder Trudeau, with organizations like Foreign Investment Review Agency and National Energy Program and so forth, which one could argue were partially effective and then washed away under Mulroney. But I'm also reminded that the state doesn't have to be the one to invoke the border by current events. So the Keystone Pipeline wasn't really, I mean, it had to go through the State Department and get presidential approval. Obama ultimately said no, Trump will say yes, but it was about local responses of communities along the way. Northern Pass, enormously controversial issue in New England, trying to get power through what is seen by local people and environmentalists as the scenic White Mountains. That's how Canada, one of the ways that Canada hopes to get its large quantities of electricity to the urban markets of New England. And again, it's not the state invoking those borders. The relationship is being acted on by groups that aren't identified necessarily in the history books.
Excellent. Before I kick it completely open to the audience, I have one more question that I know you're all dreading because I sent it out to you, but in 25 words or less, I do this with my students all the time. How would you sum up the differences in policies in your policy field or area between Canada and the U.S.? Basically, if you're going to make a T-shirt, what would it say? How would you sum this up? So, and I'll give you a minute to think. While you're
I'm going to fail this.
I didn't get the question in advance.
Before we go to the audience, we're going to invoke the House of Commons rule with 30 seconds for questions. And you can direct the questions to one member of the panel or all three or two or three. So, but if you'd be clear about that at the beginning, I'd appreciate it. So that was your moment to think. So let's start with David.
Oh, gosh. Canadian and American resource/environmental policy, far more similar than recent Canadian branding would have you think.
Excellent. I think you just made it.
It was always America first, make America great. Canada's had to both react and be defensive and offensive, and it's pretty hard to be doing both.
Excellent. Good.
So on the front of my T-shirt, for
No.
Yeah. For the U.S. side, it would be something along, they're here, damn, what do we do now? And then on the back of the T-shirt for the Canadian side would be, we want you, some of you, sort of.
Excellent. Questions from the audience? Oh, yes. The second row, and then we'll come forward. Sorry.
Would you, any of you, or all of you, like to comment on the difference in the recent election on both sides will make
I don't know why you're all looking at me. I'm not the expert
Yeah.
here.
I think the Canadian economy will come out stronger. I mean, for half a century, Canada's been looking for alternative trade players. But when you always have the U.S., you don't really have to. And maybe now, you know, the European agreement, the potential British agreement, China's, maybe it really will help Canada not be as dependent economically in terms of trade.
So I'm realizing that I'm going to have to backtrack on my answer that trade and immigration.
You can't change your T-shirt.
Well, no, I didn't talk about trade on my T-shirt, but I'll put on a new T-shirt. Currently, I think what has happened is that Canada has been incredibly reluctant to criticize the administration, the U.S. administration, on all of its immigration issues. And it's not that, you know, Canada's always been reluctant to criticize the United States, but they're particularly reluctant to criticize the United States because of the whole NAFTA renegotiation. And so there are moments where Canada would maybe normally have spoken up much more about these refugee flows or asylum flows from the US to Canada, and they have previously, and they're really not saying anything. And I think one of the reasons that they're actually being relatively nice in processing them is because they don't want to make a diplomatic issue out of this like they could, so it's all being sort of under the radar. They're sending people down to Florida to have, you know, signs and like give messaging in Creole on the radio stations, please don't come, your chances of asylum are really low, but they're not making a big diplomatic stink because they don't want to piss off Trump. And then the second area where they could have been doing more and they're not is around deferred action for childhood arrivals. So as some of you might know, I've written an op-ed with one of Canada's senators calling on Canada to let in many more of the deferred action for childhood arrival people into Canada. And I've been met with a wall of silence. And my understanding of the wall of silence is that they do not want this to be an issue because they're so worried about NAFTA renegotiation. So that's my asterisk on the previous question.
Nothing to add.
Nothing to add, okay. The front row, please, yes.
I was going to ask, sorry.
Irene?
I was interested in what you guys have to say too, but do you see a change in the attitude from immigrants about Canada versus the U.S. because of the Trump election, and even because of things like climate change? The climate is now, in the next 50 years, is expected to be a lot more hospitable and more arable land in Canada. Do you suspect that immigrants may want to
go more to Canada than the U.S. So I haven't done interviews with prospective migrants in countries, so I can't give you a direct answer. I would say the following. A lot of migration is based on your family and friendship networks. And so to that extent, it's very hard to change those patterns because people are going to go where their families are or where they have information because someone from their village is located there and they're going to help them get a job and find an apartment and all the rest of it. And so that's sort of deep structural, and regardless of the politics, you're still going to want to go where your family and your friends are. So that's not going to change that much. The second, for very high-skilled immigrants, they have somewhat of a choice, and potentially for those who feel like political discourse is important to them, they might make a choice. So I would say especially people who might be of Muslim faith, they might be reconsidering where they want to go, and so maybe Canada is going to have the advantage of trying to get sort of very highly skilled migrants of Muslim faith. But for those who are not of Muslim faith, depending on their industry, I think the U.S. is still sort of seen as the place to be. So if you're the very top in your health research profession, or you're the very top physicist, or the very top, tech person, biotech person, a lot of people who are ambitious still want to come to the United States, and because they're highly skilled, they can avoid a lot of the bad things happening in the U.S. because a lot of it is directed at undocumented migrants. So I think that would be another element that influences. Now, the one area that I think there could be a difference, which is going to have future implications, is attracting international students. Exactly. And so international student numbers, applications at Canadian universities, from what I understand, have gone up like 60–70% in the last year or two. And because in Canada, you can actually transition from being an international student to legal permanent residency, not obvious, but you can do it. That is a pathway that is completely blocked in the United States. It's much more difficult. You can do it, but it's really, really hard. And if you come over the border as an international student, you let any whisper out that you might want to stay permanently, they can use that as grounds to bar you. And so it could be that Canada and Australia and New Zealand are going to be able to pick up some of these international students if the Canadian universities can be competitive in a way that might have been a little bit less previously. So that might be a place where things change.
Other questions?
Or
Yes.
comments?
What about student applications from the U.S. to Canada to Canadian schools? Do you have any figures on that?
I don't. I have a dean of a school in the audience. I don't know if Antonia has any information on increase in applications of U.S. citizens to go to Canadian schools. Has there been an uptick? There has?
It's gone up. I mean, we don't, I don't have the numbers that differentiate the United States from the international pool as a whole, because in Canada we actually, the United States is part of our international pool. But the 60 to 70 has been at the University of Toronto.
Okay.
At McGill it's more than 30%.
Oh, is it?
And that's because historically McGill has always had an attraction for U.S. and international students. But we have seen actually, it's actually a significant increase. It doesn't mean that at least at McGill, it doesn't mean that we've actually had more students actually enrolled, because we don't have
Quotas.
but we do have a limit on how many students we can take in, particularly at the undergraduate level. So it hasn't really affected the numbers of students that we've accepted, but we've certainly seen the pressure from the increased number of admission demands to applications.
Thank you. Yes.
Can you address the issue of national identity, cultural identity through the U.S. and Canadian relationship? It appears to me to be now Canadians have a very strong sense of kind of themselves in relation to the United States, maybe over other periods, but I don't have that historical perspective. Can you speak to that?
It'd be interesting to think about like Hydro-Quebec and nationalism. In terms of immigration, I would say that there's definitely a difference. Canadian public opinion is much more pro-immigrant than almost any other OECD country in the world currently. So Canadians tend to be more in favor of immigration. They think immigration's working well. They're relatively open to immigration. And what's very unlike many of other advanced Western democracies is that has actually been increasing slightly. So it's been going up, which is against the trends in other countries. That said, there is really good, at least US-Canada data that suggests that there is a good 30% of Canadians, up to 40% of Canadians, that I don't think they would necessarily vote for Trump, but they express similar concerns around immigration as you might have for the people who support Trump. So people worried that immigrants take jobs, people worried about the cultural background of immigrants, people worried that immigrants are going to create fragmentation, and in some cases outright pretty racist or sort of xenophobic feelings about certain types of people. And so in that respect, public opinion is actually much more similar in some ways across the border. And I would say one of the big differences that I think really matter right now is political leadership. I think that in Canada there has been much more agreement across the political spectrum among the parties and then between the federal government and the provincial governments that immigration is a good thing for the country because it is felt that it's managed, that it's the right kind of people, that it feeds into economic growth. And it really seems that there's this consensus. I would argue, as someone who does a lot of political sociology, that it's not just because there's this ideational consensus. It's also the case that almost 1 in 5 people who live in Canada were born outside of Canada. So you have 20% of the population that's foreign-born. Almost all of them are Canadian citizens. 85% of the immigrants are Canadian citizens. So that means you have a lot of voters, especially in places like Toronto and Vancouver, who can have an impact on elections. And so it's very hard for a very strong anti-immigrant platform to get very far in the current moment. And I think that has an impact on all of the political leaders' way of articulating immigration that then feeds as a feedback loop into public opinion. And you can see in the US that that's very different right now.
Yes.
I'd like to just follow up on that as well with the discussion of the aging workforce, especially in Canada, and how that impacts both trade and immigration.
You want to do trade?
There isn't that big a difference between the aging in the two countries. They're both aging. The U.S. is aging a little faster.
Slower.
It's a little slower.
A little bit slower.
I don't know that in terms of Canada-U.S. comparisons, that the aging matters, other than eventually you're going to need workers, and immigrants are one of the places to get them. So even countries that are very closed up will be pushed by economic forces 15, 20 years from now. If you don't have your own children being born, you're going to have to import the workers.
I mean, so the U.S. fertility rate, like how many kids are being born, is a little bit under 2.1, but it's close. So the U.S. is much closer, whereas Canada, it's lower, especially in certain places in Canada. But I would say that what's more interesting is how that rhetoric is used differently. Like in Canada, it is always said, you know, we need these people, who's going to pay for your pensions, we really need immigrants. And in some places in the U.S., it's somewhat similar, but that's just not seen as a policy option. And I think it's interesting to think about what rhetoric is used to support immigration, especially when you think of like Japan. I realize this is not about Japan, but like Japan is an interesting country because they really have an aging population problem. They have a major population problem. And you know, they have one of the lowest rates of immigration in the OECD because that's just not a legitimate policy solution to their problem. So I think what's more interesting is the fact that in Canada, you hear this used all the time. But a lot of the economic research says that, you know, even bringing in immigration, it's not going to change your population pyramid that much. It'll change it a bit, but not in like hugely consequential ways.
If I can follow up with David for a minute, this is somewhat anecdotal and somewhat not. How much of the resource development relies on immigration or immigrant labor? And the anecdotal part is that my husband works with international students a lot, and a lot of the students who go to his private elite college, because they can't stay in the US, take their advanced degrees and go to Canada to work in the energy industry. They don't want to go back to the Middle East, but there are reasons they can't stay here. So I didn't know whether that affects, especially because in the oil industry there's movement between those areas, and whether that's a particular type of immigration and resource development.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's complicated. Historically, it was the poorest and new immigrants who were always the manual labor involved in large-scale resource projects of every kind. But the oil patch may be different. St. John's, Newfoundland seems to clear out every couple of weeks as the planes go to Alberta. Yeah.
So it's got internal as well as external.
I was going to comment on the age and also the identities. I find it very difficult to talk about a Canadian national identity or an American, knowing as we do as citizens and or scholars of one country or the other, that there are multiple identities. Some regional, some rural, some urban, and it's the same thing in demographics. I mean, I'm in New England, where it's a very rapidly aging demographic, and it's almost a different country from other parts of the United States. So, very difficult for me to cast generalizations across one country or another. Again, I would look within the countries, and I see more commonalities than anything else.
One more question?
Or comment.
Or comment.
Yeah, it's going to be Chuck.
Yes.
Wouldn't you say with regard to this question of immigration, aging, and also identity, that the attitudes in Quebec are very different from English Canada? I mean, there's always been a very strong support for immigration in Quebec, but of course it has to be
A certain kind of people.
French, and that's hard to select people internationally in that way, especially after the European part of it has dried up somewhat. So, but still, the difference between Quebec and the others in these matters is pretty striking, I think, pretty sharply edged.
And they also do a very effective job Frenchifying those who don't bring French, right? I mean, numerous immigrants during the Colombian Civil War came out of Colombia, landed in Quebec City, and immediately plugged into intensive French programs, and their kids in the school, and within one generation, you're a French speaker. So I don't think they're looking strictly for French speakers, though those would certainly be more ideal. But there may well be someone else in this room who could speak to that issue better than I could. Or a representative of the government of Quebec who would like to provide the official line. Yeah.
I mean, if you look at public opinion polls, there aren't as huge as differences in stated public opinion to these polls as sometimes you hear in the political rhetoric. Mm-hmm. Quebec is, people who live in Quebec, especially Francophones, are more worried about Muslim migrants than in other parts of Canada. People in Quebec would argue that that's in part because they've had a higher percentage of people of Muslim faith in their immigrant pool than other parts of Canada, and so it's become more of an issue. I think there's a very interesting question for this discussion of borders and exchange about who are the interlocutors that we talk to, and we being academics, government officials, ordinary people, when we get our impressions of what are the public policy issues of the day, like who's an immigrant, are they good, are they bad, are they a problem? And one thing that strikes me about the Francophone space is that because of common language, they are more tapped into some of the discourses that are coming from France. And the French in particular are extremely worried about Muslim immigrants and have these debates around the veil. And so I think it's an interesting empirical question that when you have different, ideational, I don't know how you call this, like different spaces, different transnational spaces of ideas, how that might influence then some of the public debate. And I'm just always struck in Quebec that, especially Francophones, they are reading and listening to and talking with people from France. And I wonder to what extent that might change the discourse a little bit more in Quebec, whereas Anglo-Canadians are, they hear about the US all the time. And so the debates that are in the United States influence Anglo-Canadians more. And so one question with Trump in office now in the United States is this is going to prime anti-Muslim sentiment among Anglo-Canadians? And the answer might be yes. It might be that as a discourse in the United States becomes legitimate, it's no longer politically incorrect to say some of these pretty hateful things, that Anglo-Canadians or some Anglo-Canadians will start adopting this too. That's just speculation.
That might be true, but it may be that the Muslim question, there is some resistance in Quebec, but that's a subcomponent of a larger immigration picture. And the immigration attitude in Quebec has been very strong and positive across all the parties. There's there's an agreement about that. I think not to acknowledge that means that Quebec is not getting its due. It's a very supportive immigration area.
No, I think it's similar to other provinces.
And I think that leads into a great panel for the Enders in 2 years.
The next one. Yeah.
What are national influences outside of Canada and the U.S. to these three regions? So thank you so much for all your attention and questions.
Thank you, Carol.
And thank you to our panelists for an excellent job.
Thank you.